Arrogant Judge Finch orders 76-year-old war heroine, Evelyn Hayes, to stand. Her frail hand grips a cane, her body trembles. The courtroom's stunning defiance, as they rise for her, ignites a firestorm he never saw coming, shaking his world to its core. Courtroom 7 of the Oakmont City Municipal Courthouse felt less like a hall of justice and more like a forgotten archive of human misery. The air, thick with the cloying scent of industrial lemon cleaner failing to mask decades of stale anxiety, hung heavy. Sunlight, fractured by grimy windows, did little to cheer the dull, worn oak of the pews and the judge's imposing bench. Beside it, the state flag and Old Glory drooped, as if weary of the proceedings they oversaw. A faded print of Lady Justice, blindfolded and holding her scales, adorned one wall, her promise of impartiality feeling more like a cruel jest in the dim light. Into this arena of weary bureaucracy shuffled Evelyn Hayes. At 76, her slight frame was noticeably stooped, a testament to a life of service and the lingering ghosts of old injuries. She leaned heavily on a simple, dark wooden cane, each step measured and careful. Her face, a roadmap of wrinkles etched by time and trial, held a surprising softness around the eyes, though today they were clouded with a quiet apprehension. She wore a neatly pressed but well-worn khaki shirt and matching slacks, reminiscent of a service uniform, modest and unassuming. Pinned discreetly to her collar was a small, burnished bronze star, an almost invisible emblem of a past she rarely spoke about. Evie settled gingerly into the hard wooden chair at the defendant's table, her public defender, Sarah Jenkins, offering a hesitant, encouraging smile. Sarah, barely 5 years out of law school, possessed an earnestness that hadn't yet been entirely eroded by the daily grind of the public defender's office. She fiddled with the worn file, containing the sum of Evie's current predicament, a handful of unpaid parking tickets. The fines themselves weren't astronomical, but Evie's failure to appear at 2 prior summonses had escalated the matter to a contempt charge. The real story, buried beneath the bureaucratic summonses, was a series of unfortunate, entirely human failings, none of them malicious. The initial notices had been mailed to an old address. Evie had moved to a small, assisted living apartment after a fall the previous year, and the mail forwarding had lapsed. When a notice finally reached her, the complex legal jargon and the looming court date had thrown her into a state of flustered confusion. Her eyesight wasn't what it used to be, and the tiny print felt designed to intimidate. "All rise." The bailiff's voice, sharp and commanding, sliced through the courtroom's low murmur. Judge Alastair Finch swept in, his black robes billowing, an air of impatient authority preceding him. In his early 50s, with a meticulously groomed appearance and a gaze that seemed to assess and dismiss in a single sweep, Finch was known for his rigid adherence to protocol and his intolerance for anything he deemed a waste of the court's precious time. His expression, as he settled onto his high-backed chair and surveyed the room, was one of stern disapproval, as if the day's docket was a personal affront. He glanced dismissively at the file, then at Evie. Case 2024, CR 881, City of Oakmont vs. Evelyn Hayes. Ms. Hayes, you are here on a charge of contempt for failure to appear. This court does not take such matters lightly. His voice was crisp, each word a verbal gavel tap. Sarah Jenkins rose, her voice a little shaky but determined. Your Honor, Ms. Hayes is 76 years old and has had considerable difficulty navigating these proceedings. The initial notices went to an incorrect address, and her health conditions make travel and understanding complex documents challenging. Judge Finch raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Her health conditions, Ms. Jenkins? Or her unwillingness to take civic duties seriously? The law applies equally to all, regardless of age or alleged ailments. He waved a dismissive hand. Let's not protract this. How does your client plead to the original parking violations, so we can move on to the contempt? His tone suggested Evie was an inconvenient obstruction in his otherwise orderly day. Part 2, the callous order and the agonizing attempt. Approximate, 490 words. Sarah Jenkins persisted, her voice gaining a little more firmness. Your Honor, we are not disputing the parking tickets themselves. Ms. Hayes is prepared to address those. However, regarding the failure to appear, there were significant mitigating circumstances. She lives alone, relies on an unreliable community shuttle service with a stop nearly a mile from her current residence, and has limited mobility due to service-connected injuries and age-related arthritis. She attempted to call the clerk's office multiple times but was unable to get through. Judge Finch's lips thinned into a moue of distaste. He clearly categorized these explanations under excuses. Service-connected injuries. Ms. Jenkins, unless she's claiming those injuries prevented her from understanding a simple summons, I fail to see the relevance. People make arrangements. People find a way if they respect the authority of this court. He tapped his pen impatiently. We will deal with the contempt charge first. Given her prior failures to appear, I am finding Ms. Hayes in contempt of court. Before I pronounce sentence, the defendant will rise and face this court. A chill permeated the already cool courtroom. Sarah immediately began, Your Honor, my client. But Evie, with a quiet dignity that belied her physical frailty, placed a trembling hand on Sarah's arm. It's all right, dear, she murmured, then addressed the judge, her voice soft but clear, carrying the faintest tremor of age and nerves. Your Honor, I mean no disrespect, truly. But I am an old woman. My legs are not what they once were. It is very painful for me to stand for any length of time, especially today. My arthritis is particularly bad, and, well, these old bones took a beating when I served my country. She gestured vaguely to her hip. Judge Finch's expression hardened, a flicker of something that looked like derision in his eyes. Ms. Hayes, this is a court of law, not a clinic for airing your grievances. I see no wheelchair, no crutches apart from that, stick. He gestured dismissively at her cane. Frankly, what I perceive is a defendant attempting to garner undue sympathy through a recitation of her age and unverified past. This court will not be manipulated. Decorum will be maintained. Respect will be shown. You will stand to receive your sentence, or you will be held in further contempt. Is that clear? The air crackled with tension. Even the court reporter paused, fingers hovering over her steno machine. Evie looked at Sarah, whose face was a mask of helpless frustration. Then, she looked back at Judge Finch, her gaze steady despite the flush rising on her wrinkled cheeks. With a sigh so faint it was almost inaudible, a sigh of resignation rather than defeat, she nodded. Gripping her cane with one white-knuckled hand and the edge of the defendant's table with the other, Evie Hayes began the Herculean effort of pushing herself to her feet. Her body trembled visibly. A bead of sweat traced a path down her temple. Her breath hitched with a small, stifled gasp of pain as she put weight on her protesting joints. For a moment, she was almost upright, swaying precariously. A silent, collective breath was held by the few onlookers. Then, a tremor ran through her left leg, a legacy of shrapnel from a lifetime ago, exacerbated by 76 years of gravity. Her balance faltered. Her supporting hand slipped on the polished wood. I can't, she whispered, as she began to buckle, a slow-motion collapse that Sarah Jenkins lunged to prevent, catching her just before she hit the unforgiving floor. Part 3, The Silent Uprising and Unexpected Allies. Approximate, 590 words. The sight of the elderly woman, metals glinting faintly on her collar, crumpling in her attempt to obey a heartless command, sent a palpable shockwave through the courtroom. Sarah Jenkins, eyes wide with alarm and anger, struggled to support Evie, easing her back into the chair. Your Honor, this is unconscionable, she exclaimed, her voice trembling with indignation. Judge Finch, momentarily taken aback by the dramatic collapse, quickly regained his composure, though a flush crept up his neck. The defendant made her choice, Ms. Jenkins. Perhaps now she understands the seriousness. Before he could finish his callous assessment, a voice, gravelly with age but firm with conviction, cut through the tense silence from the back of the courtroom. If she can't stand, then I'll stand for her. All heads turned. Frank Mullen, a man whose 70-odd years were etched into his weathered face, rose slowly but deliberately from the public gallery. He wore a faded cap bearing the insignia of a Vietnam veterans chapter. His gaze, fixed on Judge Finch, was like chips of granite. A beat of stunned silence, then, beside Frank, a middle-aged woman in a postal worker's uniform stood up. "My father served. My son is serving now. I'll stand too," she declared, her voice thick with emotion. It was like a spark igniting dry tinder. One by one, then in twos and threes, people throughout the small gallery rose to their feet. An elderly woman with a walker pushed herself up with a determined grunt. A young man in a business suit, who had been idly scrolling on his phone, looked up, assessed the scene, and stood. The court stenographer, after a moment of hesitation, set aside her machine and rose. Even the bailiff, a burly man whose face usually remained impassive, looked conflicted, his hand twitching as if he too wanted to join the silent protest. Within a minute, nearly everyone in the courtroom was standing, a silent, reproachful human wall facing the bench. Only Judge Finch remained seated, his expression shifting from annoyance to disbelief, then to a burgeoning, impotent fury. "Order!" he finally roared, banging his gavel with such force that it echoed like a gunshot in the suddenly charged atmosphere. "Order in this court. This is outrageous. You are all bordering on contempt. Sit down. Sit down, I say." But no one moved. They just stood there, their silence more damning than any shouted invective. Evelyn Hayes, back in her chair, looked out at the sea of standing figures, her eyes, initially wide with surprise, now glistening with unshed tears of profound gratitude. The main courtroom doors at the rear then opened with a decisive push. A woman in a crisp, perfectly tailored Army Class A uniform strode in, her polished shoes clicking purposefully on the tiled floor. On her shoulders, the silver stars of a brigadier general gleamed under the dull courtroom lights. She was an imposing figure, radiating an aura of calm, no-nonsense authority. She surveyed the scene, the standing crowd, the flustered judge, the elderly woman at the defendant's table, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Brigadier General Eva Rostova, United States Army, Office of Veterans Affairs Congressional Liaison," she announced, her voice clear and carrying easily to every corner of the room as she advanced towards the bench. "Your Honor, I received several urgent communications regarding the proceedings in this courtroom today involving a decorated veteran. I've been authorized by the department to observe and, if necessary, to ensure proper protocols are followed concerning the rights and dignity of our nation's service members, past and present." She placed a slim, official-looking folio on the startled clerk's desk, who then hesitantly passed it up to the judge. The silent rebellion now had a 5-star endorsement. Part 4, Behind Closed Doors, Confrontation and Revelation. Approximate, 490 words. Judge Alastair Finch stared at the official folio as if it were a viper. His face, moments before flushed with anger, had paled considerably. The unexpected arrival of a brigadier general, coupled with the unprecedented silent revolt in his courtroom, had clearly thrown him off his well-ordered axis. He looked from General Rostova's unwavering gaze to the still-standing crowd, then back to the documents. This is highly irregular, General," he stammered, his usual clipped authority deserting him. "This is an active courtroom." "Indeed, Your Honor," General Rostova replied, her tone perfectly level, yet carrying an undeniable weight. "And it is precisely because of the activity reported that my presence was deemed necessary. The Department of Veterans Affairs takes credible allegations of mistreatment or denial of due process for veterans very seriously." Finch swallowed, visibly rattled. He knew he was on treacherous ground. He fumbled for his gavel. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," he announced, his voice lacking its earlier force. "General, if you would be so kind as to accompany me to my chambers." It was an invitation phrased as a request, but everyone understood it as a summons he was now forced to extend. As Judge Finch swept from the bench, a low murmur broke out in the gallery. Several people moved towards Evie, offering words of comfort and support. Frank Mullen reached her side, extending a gnarled hand. "Frank Mullen, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry," he said by way of introduction. "What he did to you, ma'am, it wasn't right. None of us were gonna stand for it." Evie grasped his hand, her own still trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you all." In Judge Finch's chambers, the atmosphere was glacial. Though the heavy oak door muffled their voices, the tension was almost palpable even outside. Finch, attempting to regain some semblance of control, gestured irritably towards a chair. "General, while I appreciate the Army's concern for veterans, this is a municipal court matter. My handling of defendants is based on established legal procedure and the need to maintain decorum." General Rostova did not sit. Instead, she opened her own slim briefcase and retrieved a folder, placing it on Finch's expansive mahogany desk. "With all due respect, Your Honor, decorum should not come at the expense of human dignity, especially for someone like Sergeant Evelyn Hayes." Finch frowned. "Sergeant?" "Indeed," Rostova confirmed. "Sergeant Evelyn Hayes, Army Nurse Corps, retired. 2 tours in Vietnam. Awarded the Bronze Star for valor for her actions during the Tet Offensive, specifically for continuing to treat wounded under direct enemy fire after her field hospital was overrun, saving the lives of at least 7 soldiers." She slid a black and white photograph across the desk. It showed a much younger Evie, barely out of her teens, her face smudged with dirt and exhaustion, but her eyes blazing with fierce determination as she knelt beside a wounded soldier. Another document detailed the permanent injuries she sustained to her hip and leg from shrapnel during that same engagement, injuries that had plagued her with increasing severity throughout her life. "The stick you referred to, Your Honor, is a medical necessity, not a prop for sympathy." Judge Finch stared at the photograph, then at the commendation for the Bronze Star, his expression unreadable. The image of the determined young nurse in the chaos of war was a stark contrast to the frail old woman he had berated in his courtroom. He picked up the commendation, his fingers tracing the official seal. A long silence stretched, broken only by the distant sound of a siren. Part 5, The Public Apology and Justice Delayed, Not Denied. Approximate, 390 words. When Judge Finch returned to the bench, the transformation was palpable. His usual brisk, almost arrogant stride was replaced by a more measured, somber gait. The recess had clearly been a crucible. He surveyed the courtroom, where the spectators, though now seated at General Rostova's quiet request during the break, watched him with expectant, wary eyes. General Rostova stood discreetly near the side, an observer whose presence spoke volumes. Judge Finch cleared his throat, a nervousness now apparent that had been entirely absent before. He looked directly at Evelyn Hayes, who met his gaze with her quiet, unwavering dignity. "Miss Hayes." "Sergeant Hayes," he began, his voice softer, stripped of its earlier harshness. "This court, and I, personally, owe you a profound and unreserved apology." A collective intake of breath rippled through the courtroom. Judicial apologies were rarer than hen's teeth in Oakmont. In my attempt to uphold what I perceived as the necessary rigor of these proceedings, I failed. I failed to see beyond the immediate charge and recognize the individual before me. I failed to extend the basic courtesy and respect that you, particularly as a veteran who has served this nation with distinction and sacrifice, unequivocally deserve. He shuffled some papers, a gesture that seemed less about organization and more about finding a place for his suddenly unsteady hands. "The charge of contempt of court against you is hereby dismissed with prejudice." He looked towards the city prosecutor, who nodded in understanding. "Furthermore, regarding the original parking citations, I am instructing the prosecutor's office to review this matter with a view toward dismissal or a resolution that fully considers Ms. Hayes' circumstances and her commendable record. I trust that will be handled with the appropriate sensitivity." He paused, then continued, his voice gaining a new, unfamiliar note of humility. More broadly, what transpired here today has highlighted a serious failing in our court's accessibility and our procedures for dealing with elderly citizens and those with disabilities, especially our veterans. I am therefore issuing an immediate administrative order for a comprehensive review of this courthouse's accessibility protocols and sensitivity training for all court personnel. We must, and we will, do better. Evie Hayes listened, her expression composed. When he finished, she inclined her head slightly. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "I never asked for special treatment, only to be treated with understanding. All any of us who served ask is that our country remembers us, not for any glory, but for the simple fact that we tried to do our duty. And that when we are old and a little broken, we are met with compassion, not condemnation." Judge Finch held her gaze for a long moment. "Your point is well taken, Sergeant Hayes. This court is adjourned." He tapped the gavel, gently this time. Part 6, The Aftermath and the Dawn of Change. Approximate, 390 words. The events in Courtroom 7 didn't stay confined within its tired walls. A freelance journalist, initially there to cover a zoning dispute and bored to tears, had witnessed the entire drama. Her hastily written piece, When a Courtroom Stood, Veterans' Dignity Upheld by Silent Protest, complete with a grainy cell phone photo of the gallery on their feet, hit a local online news portal by late afternoon. From there, it was picked up by regional outlets, then amplified by veterans advocacy groups on social media. By nightfall, #StandForSGTHayes was trending. Evie Hayes found herself an unintentional symbol. Reporters camped outside her modest apartment building. She answered a few tentative questions, always deflecting praise, always emphasizing that this wasn't about her, but about how the system treats its most vulnerable. "I'm just one old lady," she told a persistent young newscaster. "But there are thousands like me, who served, who just want to live out their days with a little peace and respect." The Oakmont City Council, spurred by the media attention and a pointed call from General Rostova's office, hastily scheduled an emergency session to discuss accessibility and veteran support services within municipal facilities. Judge Alastair Finch, to the surprise of many, attended. He didn't speak of the specifics of Evie's case, but he did make a public statement about the judiciary's responsibility to ensure justice is not only blind, but also compassionate and accessible to all, regardless of age or physical limitation. Privately, he initiated contact with local veterans organizations, seeking their input on the court review he'd ordered. It was the beginning of a slow, internal thaw. Frank Mullen, the veteran who first stood, found himself a local hero, though he waved it off. Did what anyone should have done, he'd grumble, before passionately advocating for better shuttle services for seniors. The small group who had stood with him formed an informal, court watchers group, dedicated to observing proceedings and advocating for citizens they felt were being unfairly treated by the bureaucracy. Evie, with Sarah Jenkins and General Rostova's encouragement, agreed to meet with the mayor's newly formed task force on elder and veteran affairs. She didn't deliver fiery speeches, but her quiet, dignified account of her struggles, her simple requests for clearer communication from city offices, accessible transportation, and a little more patience from those in authority, resonated deeply. The bronze star on her collar, now a little more visible, lent unspoken weight to her words. Change, it seemed, was creaking into motion, one small, hard-won step at a time. Part 7, Lasting Impact and Enduring Respect. Approximate, 230 words for story plus 100 words for interactive ending. A year later, Courtroom 7 looked subtly different. A new, gently sloping ramp ran alongside the steps to the witness stand. The defendant's table was now adjustable in height. Small notices, in larger, clearer print, outlined procedures for requesting assistance. Judge Finch, presiding over a minor traffic dispute, paused to patiently explain a complex point of law to an elderly defendant, even offering a recess so the man could confer with his legal aid. The judge caught Evie's eye. She'd been invited, along with Frank Mullen and General Rostova, to a small, informal gathering marking the first anniversary of improvements, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Later, Evie sat with Frank at a small cafe near the courthouse. The city had indeed improved its elderly transport service, and the court now had a dedicated liaison for veterans needing assistance. "You know, Frank," Evie said, stirring her tea, "that day, I felt so small, so humiliated when he ordered me to stand. I thought I'd just fade away." Frank Mullen grunted. "You didn't fade, Evie. You, and all those folks who stood with you, you shone a light." Evie smiled, a gentle, wistful expression. "Perhaps," she mused. "Perhaps we all learned that sometimes, the truest way to stand tall is to stand together, especially for those who find it hardest to stand alone." Her gaze drifted to the courthouse across the street, no longer a place of dread, but a place where a small, important battle for dignity had been fought, and in its own quiet way, won. It wasn't a grand victory, but it was real. And for Evie, and for many others, that was more than enough. It was a promise kept. Evelyn Hayes's quiet courage in the face of rigid bureaucracy reminds us of the power of collective action and simple human decency. What part of Evelyn's story resonated with you the most? Comment below. Let's show our respect for unsung heroines like Evelyn and all veterans who ask only for dignity. They stood for us, it's our turn to stand for them and with them. Have you ever witnessed a moment where ordinary people stood up against injustice for someone vulnerable, or experienced such solidarity yourself? Share your experience in the comments, let's inspire each other. If this story touched your heart, please like and share it to spread the message of compassion and respect. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter. Evelyn's story teaches us that true strength isn't just about standing tall alone, but about the courage to stand together.